step is to kind of share and work through things that you do or don't know. I don't want you to talk more than a minute each, because this could go a long time. So what needs to happen is for no more than a minute, you need to be talking about what you annotated, and then the next person goes, and the next person goes. You do have my permission to use a cell phone timer if you want to, or you could make a judgment call. Does that make sense? Cell phones are okay if you're using it as a timer, and you're only talking for 1 minute each. So everybody talks once, and we'll go in reverse order. So the baby will go first, then the middle one, and then the oldest person. Pause and go. Alright, so what I'm going to do is highlight the things here that I think you guys are going to struggle the most on. Now, if there's terms that I don't cover, you need to make a note and you need to have me cover them in the next video or next notes. So if you look at this chart, hopefully you guys can see this. This chart is kind of like a hierarchy for analysis and different things you should do analysis for. Now all these things are important, but what tends to be on the lower end, of course this is backwards, sorry. On the lower end, you have like diction, syntax, imagery, figurative language, which is the organization, structure, and form. That's kind of the lower level of analysis. So when you're looking at a book, how is it put together is one thing that you should pick apart, but it's not the most intense thing you could pick apart. It's still important to do it though. Don't get me wrong. So for instance, The Book Thief has a very interesting organization, structure, and form. It's got these little like blurbs in the middle of it. You guys should have noticed, I mean, it's a novel, but yet it's not. It plays with structure. So you would discuss why. Why does Cusack choose to add these little, spurts of information? What effect does it have on you as the reader? Also look at some of the diction. Diction is word choice. It's a fancy way of saying word choice, so you can write that down. So diction would be, like if I'm describing something, that's pretty versus that's gorgeous. Gorgeous is a strong diction choice. That's pretty, it's an okay diction choice. And authors will use different word choices to create different things. Alright, like for instance, calling Rudy's hair lemon colored. Think about that for a second. Why would he say lemon instead of yellow or golden? Pause and talk about that for no more than a minute. Go. Hopefully you guys came up with, when I think of lemon, it makes more sense at the end of the book. His death was bitter. I hated this death. I thought it was a very sour point in the plot. So maybe that lemon word choice could have been a foreshadow. Could have been kind of a representation of the very sour, tragic end that he came to. I could be wrong. I could be right. I have evidence to prove it, though, and that's analysis. It's not just saying Rudy is a character with yellow hair that looks kind of lemony. Syntax is sentence structure. Syntax is a fancy word for how are your sentences put together. So if you have an author who writes really long sentences, why is he doing that? So for instance, there's a book called The Things They Carried, and the sentences are like this long. And they're giving lists, lots and lots of lists. And the author is doing it because he's trying to create the sense of being overwhelmed. Because you're reading this long sentence and you get tired. You try to read it aloud, you barely have time for a breath. Sometimes authors use short syntax, like using 2-word sentences. Those are kind of created for punch or impact. Imagery you guys should already know. Figurative language is basically things like hyperbole, onomatopoeia. Lit devices is another way to think of figurative language. Now the middle stuff, these are different appeals. These are the ways that the author is able to get to you. Logos is your brain. Think of like logic. Logos is how do they appeal to the natural logic of things. If a story does not make sense, for instance, this guy flies. He flies to school. Our logic says, what? That doesn't make any sense. Now, Superman, this is not a great AP example, but it does work. Superman, the logic of why he can fly is because he's from another planet and the gravity is different. So that makes sense. The logic, the logos makes sense. How does the author make the story make sense? Alright? Ethos is kind of it's kind of think of ethics a little bit, but it's their, ability to talk about what they're talking about, like they have the background to talk about it. So for instance, if you go to a hospital and you run into a teacher and the teacher tries to diagnose you with something, they don't really have the ethos to diagnose you. They don't have the background or the credibility is kind of a way to think about it. Ethos is the credibility to talk about what they're talking about. So for instance, Langston Hughes is a writer. He's African American. He has the ethos to talk about African American rights and things related to prejudice because he's lived it. He's had the credibility. He's had the experience. Pathos, I like to think, refers to your heart. And that's how do they get to the emotions of you. So pathos is how they get to your emotional energies. So for instance, when Rudy dies, Zusak does a great job with pathos, because, or pathos is another way to say it, because we have spent 500 pages getting to love Rudy, and so it really hurts us to see him die. Now, this is kind of the middle stuff, and then you can see that this is the most intense, and also sometimes the most difficult stuff to do analysis on. So, rhetorical situation, rhetoric is kind of a reference to communication, like how you verbally speak and talk, how you write. It's the way that you communicate, and it's the different methods you use to communicate. So you have exigence, audience, and purpose. Now you guys kind of are familiar with audience and purpose. Who are they writing to? So Zusak is kind of writing to people who are interested in the Holocaust. His audience is sometimes considered younger people, like adolescents. Sometimes you have people's audience depend based on their background. So for instance, how to read literature like a professor. This guy's audience is people who like literature. Purpose is also why did they write it? All right, why did Sophocles choose to write Oedipus's story into a play? Like, what's his purpose behind doing that? And the exigence kind of goes into it all. It's a fancy word. It does get me too sometimes. It's kind of like the issue or the problem that sparked their desire to write what they write. It's inspiration, but it could be negative inspiration just as much as positive. So, I'm trying to think of a good example here. But let's say The Kite Runner is a book that we're going to read. In The Kite Runner, the author is writing about the Middle East, and he published his book right after 9/11. You could argue his exigence to publish that was because America was going through a lot of conflict about how much they were afraid of the Middle Eastern person. But it's what inspires them to write what they write. And you see this a lot with authors and the social constraints that they face. So for instance, people during the Civil War, slaves, their exigence to write their biographies was because they were free and because they were under the restrictions and the prejudice and the hatred of white plantation owners. So exigence is kind of what pushes a person to write what they need to write. So hopefully you guys were taking notes as you guys were listening to me. I'm sorry that I lectured so much here, but this chart is important, and we're going to refer to this a lot. So I'm going to ask you guys, what's the exigence, all right? What seems to push Foster to write this book? What seemed to push Sophocles to write Oedipus's story down? Those are the types of things. Now we have an activity to apply this chart to a piece of literature. Now, I'm not doubting your intelligence here. We're going to read a picture book. This picture book is amazing, by the way. I love picture books. I know picture books are for kids normally, but they are a great way to study analysis to start. So what's going to happen for the next few minutes is you guys are going to read this. I'll have you debate who's going to read it aloud. I don't care. One person needs to read it aloud. You do need to huddle and get close to each other so you can see. If you guys notice, it's a picture book, so it's short, but I want you guys to read, and some of the reading is like all over the place. So what I'd like you guys to do is to read this book. Just read it. Don't talk about it. Just read it once through. When you get done reading it, I'd like you guys to turn your paper over and you see where Fox is. What I'd like you to do is look more at the top part of the chart and the bottom, and I'd like you guys to write down some notes and some reflections. So what seems to be Margaret Wilde and Ron Brooks' exigence? What seems to be their purpose for writing this? Why? Who's their audience? Then I want you to look at organization, structure, and form. What word choices do they use? What do you notice about the syntax? What do you notice about just the way it's put together? It's visually put together. Like, what about the pictures? What about the colors? I want you to do analysis on this. If you write down, this is a story about a fox and a bird and a dog, I'm going to slap you through the YouTube video. That's a summary. I don't need to know what the book is about necessarily. I need to know why the book was written and what the author did and why they did it. So why did they use these characters and animals instead of those animals? Does that make sense? If it doesn't, you should try to ask me before you start. You're reading the book. One person's reading aloud. When you get done, you're independently going to take notes on your chart, and you're going to write down what you noticed and push analysis more than summary. And then when you get done, you guys are going to talk out what you noticed. I'd like you to push pause, and I'd like you to go. Okay, so you look through the video. Now, what I need you guys to do is I'd like one person to be the recorder, and I'd like you guys to come up with 5 of your best analysis discussion points. So what are 5 things that you guys got out of this picture book in relationship to this chart that you think was good analysis? I'm going to give you an example. Now, if this is one thing that you discussed, that's great. One thing that I noticed from a more analytical perspective is the fact that this picture book has fonts that go different ways. So why would the author do that? I think the author is doing that to help show the chaos and kind of the different nature of the characters and the instability of the friendship that is going on between the 2 main characters. I think it creates disorder. I mean, you're flipping the book all around, and it creates this kind of hectic situation. And I think that's why they did it. I don't think they did this because they're idiots. I don't think that they, ran out of room here, so they had to write it there. I think they're doing it to create an effect. And I think that this book structurally mimics some very interesting, chaotic moments. So that's an analysis thing. Now, if I were to say this book is written and the bird, hurts its arm, and then, the fox, comes to it, and the dog, that's not what I'm looking for. So you're going to pause again, and you're going to write down 5 of your best analysis points. One person needs to take on the recording. So whoever read, you're off the hook. The other 2 need to decide. So pause and go. Alright, so you've looked at analysis. Now you're going to turn this paper in, as well as your what is analysis responses, into the box so I can kind of see what you're doing. The last thing that we're going to do today is look at a poem. And the poem is called Eagle. It's by Tennyson. Now, you have 3 poems on this handout. These other poems are for a later date, so please don't read them yet. Just wait. I want you to read this poem called The Eagle. When you read it, I want you to read it once and just read it. I want you to read it twice, and I want you to mark a couple things that you're feeling or noticing. And then I want you to read it a 3rd time, and when you read it a 3rd time, one of you will read it aloud. Now, somebody's already read the picture book, so you're 3rd person, this is your turn. I want you to read The Eagle, and when you guys get done, I'd like you guys to write down a response to why poetry. Like, why is poetry so important? Now, definitely push analysis skills, like always, but why poetry? Because the AP Literature class is largely focused on poetry. AP Language is focused on nonfiction. So we're not taking AP Language, we're taking AP Lit. So why poetry? Because you're going to be doing poetry a lot. So right now, you're going to read it a couple times through on your own. First time, you're just reading it. Second time, you can read it and make some notes. When you guys are done, and everybody's done, you're going to do an oral reading for the 3rd time. So, go. Alright. Now, it's the end of the day. I appreciate you guys listening to me on this video for the whole time. You guys should talk about why poetry, and what we're going to do is you guys are going to write your responses, and I'm going to look at them and kind of give you my feedback to your feedback. Another thing you guys need to realize is you